If any of you are fans of yokai, you may be familiar with the ones that are possessed regular household tools or inanimate objects that develop a soul and come alive. In later years, this class of supernatural creatures eventually came to be known as tsukumogami, but while that specific term is actually relatively new, stories of these living objects are actually very old, and one of them is the subject of today's story, which happened almost 1,000 years ago. I will also mention that today's story is a little shorter than usual, but it's still a fascinating look into the nature of ancient Japanese oni, because this oni is kind of weird, kind of like the previous oni we saw. Yokoso owashitare, and welcome back to yet another classical Japanese folktale. If you like ancient Japanese history, Japanese culture, or you just like storytelling in general, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel because there are still plenty more stories where this one came from. And with all of that out of the way, let's just get into it. Once upon a time, ima wa mukashi, there was a man that the people called the Right Minister of the Ono Palace. At least that's my best translation for it. For those of you unfamiliar with the government structure of Heian period Japan, the Minister of the Right was one of the most powerful people in the entire country. I believe he was the third most powerful person, the most powerful individual in the whole of the government, at least on paper, below the Emperor and the Minister of the Left. But regardless of where he sat in the actual totem pole, where exactly he sat, he was definitely a member of the highest echelons of society. His actual name was Sanesuke, and he was well reputed for his intelligence and his outstanding cultural capabilities, and thus was sometimes called the Sage Minister of the Right by the people in his orbit. But now that we've properly introduced him and made clear his very high societal standing and his exceptional cultural achievements, of course, because that's what all of these stories we have to make sure that we know where these people stand in society. One day, this minister, Sanesuke, had finished up some official business at the imperial palace and was on his way back home. It was sometime around midday, and the minister found himself heading south on Omiya Road. He was one of the most powerful men in the country, so of course, he was in a fancy ox-drawn cart, one that allowed him to look out the front at where they were going and everything happening. Or he may have been looking out the back. Again, I'm not entirely sure about the construction of Heian period ox carts, but basically all that matters is that he could see. He could see outside of it. It wasn't like one of those things where he couldn't. It should be noted that there were carriages, especially for women, that didn't afford such a view, as classy women especially weren't supposed to be seen by people outside of their relatives and the servants in their immediate orbit. The ancient Japanese believed that it was improper for people of particularly high status to be seen by the common rabble, and so, even if they weren't technically women, the classiest men would keep some kind of a barrier and some distance between them and the lower classes. We have to make sure that everyone in society knows exactly where everyone else is on the social ladder after all. But I guess Minister Sanesuke didn't really care if he was going to be seen by the rabble this day, and instead had chosen a carriage that allowed him to enjoy the view of the city as he passed among its streets. Not a bad choice, in my personal opinion, but then what do I know? I'm some backwater American peasant whose tanka poetry would probably get mercilessly ridiculed and verbally annihilated by any Heian capital man with even half of a brain for poetry. Anyway, as I was saying, the minister was aboard a carriage that afforded him a view, and he was in no particular hurry to get back home. His duties for the day had been dealt with, and the only thing that awaited him was some well-deserved R&R. He probably had things like poetry, music, the company of very fine ladies on his mind, as his carriage made its way leisurely down Omiya Road. But being a high-ranking minister, those kinds of things were always at his disposal, and while he was definitely looking forward to them, they could wait a few extra minutes while he enjoyed the sights of the capital. It was in the midst of this very enjoyable carriage ride that the minister suddenly caught the slightest flicker of movement from something small out of the corner of his eye, followed by a small clink. Odd. Whatever that clinking noise was, it wasn't something that you typically heard on the road. He immediately shifted his focus to the source of this movement, and he gasped. He saw, passing in front of his carriage, or I guess maybe even possibly behind the carriage, a single, small aburakame, or an oil jar, slowly, deliberately hopping its way across the road, seemingly of its own accord, making a slight clink, clink, clinking sound as it did so. While I'm not entirely sure what an aburakame looked like, I imagine it was essentially a small vase-like object with a bulbous base and a long neck, the typical piece of ceramic earthenware that you would find in ancient Japan. It's possible it was more of a small bowl-like object with a lid, but again, I can't be sure. If any of you happen to know what a Heian period aburakame looked like, please let me know in the comments. That would be much appreciated. Regardless of what exactly its appearance was, Minister Sanesuke was naturally completely taken aback by this little hopping jar. Ceramics aren't exactly known for coming alive and hopping around of their own free will, after all. After his initial surprise and Minister Sanesuke regaining his bearings, he wasn't exactly sure what to make of this. Was he seeing things? Was this a trick? Was it some kind of an elaborate prank that somebody, some magic trick of some kind? He puzzled on this mystery for a few seconds before concluding that it must be some kind of a mononoke, or something like it. A mononoke being a kind of spirit that is known to attach itself to a person and bring sickness or misfortune to its unfortunate victim. For a second, Minister Sanesuke wondered if it was after him, but clearly this moving piece of pottery had very little interest in the minister or his carriage, and soon it was very apparent that it was headed for a house on the other side of the road. The original text actually includes the location of this house being west of the Omiya Road, but the other relevant street and cardinal direction are both missing from the original manuscript, but that's 1,000-year-old Japanese stories for you. Minister Sanesuke watched with slightly concerned curiosity as this little animate jar hopped up to the gate of this house, which was closed tight. It stopped for a second, almost like it was contemplating on how to proceed, and then began hopping again. But this time in the direction of the small door that was just off to the side of the actual gate, the one that servants and guardsmen and people without carriages or horses would use to go in and out. Now this side door was also shut tight, and while I don't know if there were any actual visual cues, I'm no expert on Heian period entryways after all, but given the fact that the main gate was locked, and there was no one seeking entrance, nor anyone seemingly guarding this other small door, it was pretty obvious that this small door was locked as well. But this did not seem to faze the little jar, as it hopped right on up to this small door, stopped, seemingly calculating its next move, and then in the next instant, leapt significantly higher than before, aiming itself directly at the keyhole in this door that was apparently big enough to let a little oil jar like itself through. Now again, what did a Heian period keyhole look like? I couldn't tell you, but apparently it was something that this little spirit jar felt that it could squeeze through to get inside. However, despite the jar's great leap, it fell just short of its aim and landed back on the ground in front of the door with a slightly louder clink. But this was a determined little ghost dish, and it tried again, only to fail again. And then again, it leapt and again fell short, and again, and again, and again. The minister watched, mesmerized, as this possessed piece of earthenware tried over and over again to reach the keyhole, seemingly unfazed by its mounting failures. But just when the minister began thinking that there was no chance that the little jar was going to make it and it would probably tire of its efforts, the little jar gave one final, massive leap and successfully reached its target, slipped in through the keyhole, and then disappeared inside the property. Now that the weird roadside show was over, Minister Sanesuke wasn't entirely sure what to do about it. This wasn't an everyday occurrence, obviously. He should do something, shouldn't he? But what could he do? Being the rank that he was, he couldn't just waltz up to this random house and nonchalantly tell the residents what he had witnessed. Societal standards demanded that a man of his station would have had to make a whole thing about visiting a house like that. And to be honest, calling on a house so beneath him in status would earn him the disapproval of society at large. No. Honestly, the best thing to do would be to just continue on home. And that's just what he did. Not much else to do, again. But the entire rest of the commute, he couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen and wondering to himself, was that really a mononoke? And if it was it there to cause a little bit of mischief and give everybody a cough? Or was it something much more dangerous? All of these thoughts buzzed around in his head until by and by he safely made it home. After he was back and everything was settled, he decided that he couldn't bear not knowing about what he had just saw, and so he turned to one of his servants and told him, I want you to go to such and such a house, he names where the house is, and very nonchalantly start up some conversation there and figure out if anything unusual has happened there recently. and then come and tell me everything that you hear. There. That was one way he could help out without besmirching his good, high, classy reputation. He couldn't just waltz up to some random house and start asking questions, but his servants could. Now this servant wasted no time and did as his lord bid, and surprisingly, was back in a very short time. When asked what he had heard, he reported, "My lord, I learned that there was a young girl at that house, the daughter of the man who lived there. She had been sick for the past several days with some unknown disease, but around noon today, she passed away suddenly. The whole house over there is in disarray because of it." The minister was shocked, but after a moment of thought, not actually that surprised. He had guessed that this thing was in fact a mononoke, or some other kind of demon or oni, and he had been right on the money. Whatever this thing was, it had disguised itself as a piece of crockery, snuck in through the keyhole of the gate, and finished what it had apparently been working on for several days. And thus is it said that these kinds of mononoke can change into all sorts of things, and that this particular monster very clearly had some kind of a grudge against the little girl whose life it took. Now that is the actual end of the story, which it is a little abrupt, I have to say, but the story ends where it ends. I will admit that I do like to add some small dramatic flourishes to these stories, but I'm really just the messenger, and if the story is done, well then it's done. But there is one thing I want to point out. I referred to this supernatural being as an oni multiple times, but nowhere in the body of the story is it ever actually called that, and is instead referred to the aforementioned mononoke multiple times. However, the title of this story does use the word oni to describe it, and not mononoke. So I think it's safe to assume that these words often could be interchangeable. Kind of like how in English we have 5 billion words for ghost, right? Like wraith, specter, phantom, shades, sometimes demon even. So what exactly is an oni in the Heian period? Well, it's honestly hard to really precisely define, but I'd say it's some kind of a spiritual being with the ability to shapeshift, is generally bad and likes to eat or kill human beings. Although not even these terrible beings can escape the all-powerful force of modern Japanese pop culture and getting turned into cute anime girls. But that is actually where I'm going to end all of my little commentary, and that is where the story is going to end. So if you did find this story entertaining or amusing, please don't forget to like the video, please subscribe to the channel, because again, there are plenty more of these stories, We are actually coming up to the end of discussions and stories about oni, but there are other stories. We are still in the stories dealing with spirits and ghosts and other spooky things, which is perfect for spooky season, right? I mean, it's in October now. So again, don't forget to like the video, please subscribe, and then please share with anybody that you think might be mildly interested, the people who like Japanese culture, people who, like storytelling in general, or just somebody who needs something to put on in the background while they do other things and only are half paying attention to it. That would be totally fine too. That is how I consume most of my YouTube anyway. And if you have been watching all the way up to the end here, I do thank you sincerely. Ito, ureshu koso hamerikere. And hopefully, we will see you next time for a story about a being that actually isn't an oni, because again, we're coming up on the end of oni. I think there's at least one other oni story that we have to do. But this next story isn't about an oni. But lest you think that oni are the only supernatural beings that you need to worry about, I can tell you, you are sorely mistaken. Sometimes, the scariest thing in the world is a woman with a very powerful grudge. Anyways, thanks so much guys. We'll see you later. Goodbye.